Hi everyone, welcome to See the Invisible, Living with an Invisible or Rare Disease. My name is Rhonda Franny Jefferson, and thank you so much for taking some time out to listen. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my experiences and my thoughts and ideas with you. To let you know a little about this podcast, what I'm hoping to do is spread some encouragement and positivity to everyone who has an invisible illness. These include chronic and rare illnesses as well. I also want to provide support for those who help us. There are support system, whether it's a spouse, immediate family, or whatever the situation may be. We also need to recognize that they may need some support as well. Now, normally I would review an article or something that is a reference for those who have an invisible illness, but today I'm going to do something a little bit differently. Before I do start the topic, though, I do want to say that I am in no way a medical, legal, or insurance expert. If you have any questions or issues that apply to any of those areas, please make sure that you're reaching out to an expert in that field. Briefly, I'm going to explain why I started this podcast. During quarantine and lockdown, I actually discovered podcasts. I really hadn't listened to any before. And I kind of had an idea of maybe starting one, but it wasn't too serious. At the time, I was getting over an infection. I was still feeling very, very ill. But, I kind of kept it in the back of my mind that it was something that I'd like to do. Now, with a lot of opinions about how the pandemic was handled, I did see things posted in articles on Facebook, Twitter, many different opinions, and all of those opinions were strong. I recognize that everybody is not the same. I've been very strict with self-isolating and making sure that myself and my family are taking all the necessary precautions. Some of that may be because literally on the day that things started to shut down, I saw my doctor, not related to the pandemic, but just my normal visit. And as I was leaving, she looked at me directly and said, "If you get this, you will die." And her face kind of changed because I think she realized it came out a little harshly. And, she kind of amended it to I could end up in the ICU on the ventilator, but that it was something that I needed to take very seriously. So on one of the Facebook posts, there was discussion on, how this was affecting businesses and things like that. And, I wrote a response that I did recognize that other people may not be in the same situation as I am. But many of the previous comments on the post were very, very negative about those who have any type of underlying medical condition. A lot of the responses saying that everybody else should be able to go about their business and only the elderly and those with some type of medical condition should just stay home, and that everybody was being punished because there were people who were more at risk than others. So I forget the exact, response that I gave, but basically I, did say I recognized the different situations, but I also continued with the fact that, some younger people were dying from this, that, there were some effects to someone who had healed from COVID, things such as blood clots, and even in young children. I read an article, I don't have it in front of me, but that some children were dying from some type of autoinflammatory like disease, even though they had recovered from COVID. So looking at other effects, that COVID may have, I was trying to explain why everybody needs to take proper precautions. And he basically came back and said, I'm not going to read your response. And I'm sorry. The guy that I had replied to in one of the comments, he replied back saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he wasn't going to take the time to read my rant, but he did come out and say that my life was not worth it. So, of course, I felt a little upset by that, or more than a little upset. And after a while of seething, I did begin to think, if someone said this to me, then I'm sure that there are, hundreds or thousands of people who are dealing with similar reactions to the way that the pandemic was handled. Usually I would get upset, about any response like that, but I would normally start to cry. That or I would just internalize everything. But this time I felt the need to act. So here I am. And what I want to do today is share a little bit of my journey to my diagnosis. Normally I use reference materials such as websites and articles that I've seen on different sites. But today I'm going to be a little bit more kind of free form instead of referring back and forth to an article. So if I do skip around, I apologize. I tried to make an outline so I could go in order. And also, I know I always want to send a positive message. And sometimes the journey that some of us took to our diagnosis was not an easy one. I can probably say the majority of people that have some type of illness, especially if it's an invisible illness or a rare one, have had those feelings that the journey was very difficult. So really the time period that I thought that it was urgent for me to really get a diagnosis of what was going on was after I had my first child. That was in 2008. And while through most of my life, I had some symptoms, they really came on after I had my first son, and then I did have a second child. So during that time, I was not working. I was a stay-at-home mom. And I thought, this is really the time where I need to figure out what's going on. I'm not working. That way I'm not having to try to make doctor's appointments. And that way, when I did go back to work, hopefully I was thinking I would have whatever I had under control. That did not happen. A lot of my symptoms still continued to get worse. And those symptoms included what was diagnosed as either bronchitis or a respiratory infection at least 4 times a year on average. I had some things that were diagnosed as allergies just by sight, but I'm almost wondering if it was related to my illness, because it does create a rash. But there were times where I had different rashes, things like that. There was a lot of joint and muscle pain, and at times I had trouble breathing, and my fever would actually change throughout the day. I guess I should say temperature would change throughout the day, and it would go up and down really quick. My lymph nodes were swollen, a lot of itching, and gastrointestinal issues. And probably the hardest one to get past was there would be periods of time where I couldn't swallow the smallest thing. I'm talking if I tried to swallow a spaghetti noodle or a couple grains of rice, I really had to work to swallow that. And that was very scary at times, because when that came on, my body, I think it went into a reaction that it needed to try to breathe. And usually the breathing part where where I couldn't get past the, what I now know is inflammation in my throat, and, where it made it feel like I couldn't swallow. Luckily, those never really lasted more than 10 seconds. But still, it was very scary when you can't catch your breath like that. So this was back around 2010 to 2012, where I was really seeking a diagnosis. I had these symptoms for a long time, but on a very small scale. But, they were getting more pervasive to my daily life. So during this time, I saw a number of specialists. An ear, nose, and throat doctor who also specialized in allergies. So we ran a whole gamut of, allergy tests. He thought I might even have asthma. And I also went to an arthritis doctor who works with both rheumatology and osteoarthritis. I went to a gastrointestinal doctor. And out of those, the ear, nose, and throat did have somewhat of a diagnosis, even though it may not have been exactly correct. The arthritis doctor said that I just had some osteoarthritis in my shoulder. She had done an x-ray to determine this, and the gastroenterologist was saying there is nothing wrong. He ran a dozen tests, it seemed like, and in one of them I had to drink this really nasty liquid, and I had to have x-rays taken on a certain time period. And the person who was doing the test actually said she had never seen anything like my system, but the doctor said nothing was wrong. And, the person who had actually administered the test asked me if I had Crohn's disease, because that was the only thing that she could really equate it with. But again, according to the doctor, nothing was wrong. But I did have to get back to work. And I was a little scared because there were times where I didn't know if I'd be sick. And of course, I don't want to miss a lot of time or even any time when starting a new job. But it was something that I had to do. So during that whole process, I was actually feeling a lot of times that everybody else in the world must have the same pain that I do every day. And I'm just too weak to really handle it. With doctor after doctor after doctor telling me there's either nothing wrong or nothing that serious, and not accounting for all the symptoms, then, I really started to doubt myself. So some time went by. I was doing well in my job, and after I'd been there, I think it was a little over a year, I got a call one day, and my mom had told me that my sister had collapsed at her home, and the ambulance was there, and according to my niece who had called my mom, my niece said they're working on her. And so I'm in a store on a weekend, and I get this call, and I feel that I should say this is not going to be as positive as I would like, but I really think that it's important for me to share what made me really fight. So my original plan for that day was I was going to go to the grocery store, make lunch for, my husband and boyfriend, the kids, and me. But I just went to Burger King and zoomed home, dropped it off, and my husband was actually there to greet me at the door. And just as clarification too, we were engaged for 12 years, so sometimes I may switch back to saying either my boyfriend or my husband. It's one and the same. It's just, after 12 years, I sometimes, still refer to him as my boyfriend or fiance. Or I might refer to him as my husband when discussing a time that he was still my fiance or boyfriend. But it was very strange for him to be, standing there when I got home. And my sister had an illness called neurosarcoidosis. It's a rare disorder, and actually she didn't fit the normal profile as far as certain attributes that sometimes makes someone more prone to neurosarcoidosis. And there were a lot of times where she may have just gone into the hospital because she was having some type of negative reaction to her medication, or, she just had kind of a flare up. So it was nothing for her to go into the hospital, spend, 2-3 days, come home, and everything was fine. So when I got to the door, my husband said, "Your sister called." Now, I have 9 other siblings, so he really needed to be a little bit more specific. But in my mind, I thought it was about her. And I said, "Oh, okay, she's okay. Did they figure out what was wrong?" And he said, "Oh, no, it was," and I'll just call her R for her privacy. "No, it was R, and she says you need to get to the hospital." I live in a rural area. The hospital that my sister was taken to was about 45 minutes away. So, could just kind of drop off lunch. My husband says he really thinks I need to eat something. And I was getting a little worried at that point. That was a very long 45-minute drive. The first 40, I thought I was going too slow. I'm like, I need to get there. But the last 5 minutes, I didn't want to get there. And so the sister that was closest to me in age passed away. She was on life support for a while, about 3 days. She had actually not had a heartbeat for a long time. Now, I'm not really familiar with protocol, but the nurses had one of those little breathers on that they squeeze. And I don't know if they were just trying to keep her alive technically until as many siblings as possible got there. But while, I was standing there in the room with her, after my family had just told me she had passed, they got a heartbeat. But unfortunately, it was not something she could recover from. Technically, it was not the illness that caused her death. She had an infection which dropped her blood pressure really low, and she had a heart attack. So, that was, even though I have a large family, she was closest to me in age, and I love all of my siblings. So it was kind of this, punch in the gut is the only way I can describe it. But, there were times where I did have trouble, like literally catching my breath. And by the time that she passed away, I was emotionally drained. I came home and didn't think that I'd be able to sleep, but I think my body just kind of gave out, and I fell asleep. So my sister is very important in this, and I'll get a little bit more into that in a few minutes. But almost I could say about 10 months went by, and some of the symptoms that I'd had before were starting to come back. In February, one time, I remember coming out of a store, and I had felt some tightness in my chest, possibly a cold coming on before I went into the store. But by the time I came out, it was burning my lungs. Every breath that I take felt like my lungs were on fire. I couldn't talk. My throat was really, really, red. And it was very quick for some of those symptoms to come on. So I knew I wouldn't be able to work the following day. And my doctor was actually away on a fundraiser that she ran every year. So I couldn't see her. I actually went to the ER once I found out she was on vacation or fundraising. And the nurse just gave me a cough syrup. And that was it. But between February and April, the symptoms didn't really clear up. I still felt a burning in my chest, though not as bad as before. So when I had a regular visit with my primary care doctor, at that point in time, it was actually coming back on full-fledged. And she diagnosed me with a respiratory infection, taking medication, Z-Pak, all that kind of stuff. And I told her, I just had this in February. And she told me that, if it happened again, they would really have to go in depth, figure out what was going on. But between, again, somewhere in February to around mid-April, it was a back and forth from me to the doctor, to the ER. At the time, the one immediate care center didn't accept my insurance, so, it was either the doctor or the ER. Another time, I started to get the rash all over my hands. I thought I was having an allergic reaction, and the doctor gave me some medication. He said it was probably contact dermatitis and sent me on my way. I did a follow-up with my doctor, and she gave me a shot. She said it was a steroid. I can't remember the name. It helped me feel better for a couple of days. But really, at the very, very end of March and early in April, it was getting bad very fast. I had different things popping up every day. There were days where I couldn't move, but I was still trying to work because, I didn't have unlimited sick time. So there were some days that we were slow where I was able to leave, and that really helped out. But it was a constant back and forth, like I said, to and from my doctor. And the fever spiking was really getting bad. My doctor's office was less than 10 minutes from my home. And when I left my home one time, my mom picked me up to take me to the doctor. My temperature was normal. By the time I get to the doctor, it was 102 point something. And they saw me right away because at that point they knew there had to be something wrong, but they just couldn't figure it out. And so I didn't even need to wait. And then that kind of set off a few days of testing after test. They asked if I'd ever been tested for lupus. And I had actually been tested about 10 or 12 years earlier. Another doctor in the practice who had since left had tested me for lupus. So there were these, huge panels of tests. And then on April 15th of 2013, I was really starting to lose hope that they would figure out what was wrong with me. I went to the doctor, but she just turned around and said, "You're going. You have to go to the ER. I'm calling for them to admit you. We have to find out what's going on." But when I got there, the doctor was less than thrilled. I don't know. I guess he didn't want to admit another person. I don't know. But, he was really, not very willing to run any test. The doctor said that really with my symptoms, I could have meningitis. But I did say I really doubted the diagnosis or possible diagnosis of meningitis. But the doctor didn't want to do the test because he didn't believe it was, meningitis either. But since, all my blood tests previously had come up with nothing, he really just thought I should go home. But in that moment, I knew that if I did not take a stand, I was not going to be able to make it back to the hospital if I needed again because I could not move. Every breath was just setting me on fire. It was so bad that even the follicles, like my hair follicles, pores, were itching. They were inflamed, and it was just driving me nuts. But then I got to a point where I couldn't even move to try to scratch or relieve the pain and itchiness somehow. But the doctor there, I remember he told me I had 6 different things going on at the same time, but I can't remember all of them. But I think it was eczema, a staph infection, respiratory infection, allergic reaction to something, a fungal infection. And, I stopped him and I'm like, for one thing, if I have a staph infection, you're not going to send me home, but I'm not going home. If you said I had possibly 2 or 3 of those things at the same time, I might say that, it's possible, but not all of those. And it was really frustrating for him. And at that point, my temperature was normal. And so for a while, I didn't see anyone come into my room or anything. But at some point, I started to recognize that the fever was starting to go up. And I called the nurse saying, I feel like it's going up. My fever's going up. And they did come in and check it, and it was over 102. But then they really did start moving. I was taken to a different part of the ER. A new doctor was called in to try to help. I was asked if I knew if I'd been tested for Rocky Mountain spotted fever. I don't know how many times, but it was a lot. And I just kept saying, no, I don't think it's that. So it was, again, a lot of back and forth. I'm a very hard stick as far as getting blood for lab work. And at that point, I was really, really dehydrated because of the fever and not being able to really swallow that well. They ended up taking blood from the femoral artery, which, that had to be done by a certain doctor. It just couldn't be done by any doctor. And just to kind of go back a little bit, because I did miss this part, when I was in my doctor's office, I asked her about something called Still's disease. My mom had, the same osteoarthritis doctor that I had. She had been in the office and read a magazine article about some rare form of arthritis. So when I was at home at one point, I Googled all my symptoms, and WebMD gave me this whole list of, possible illnesses. Then I went to my blood work because I could check the results online. And the only things left were meningitis and Still's disease. But I kept being told it was, it's so rare. But, I did ask if that was a possibility. Now, during this time, too, I remember looking up at the TV. And I was desperate. I didn't know what to do. I was at least standing up for myself. And through the whole time, I had been trying to not compare my situation with my sisters. It was very hard, though. So I think this is about where I'm going to stop for today. There is a little bit more that did happen to actually get to my diagnosis, but I know that based on where we're at, it will probably go into an hour or approximately an hour. So I'm going to split it up into 2 episodes. And I do just want to point out, I know that I try to stay more positive, but I think it's important to speak about the journey so that other people who have difficulty obtaining a diagnosis know that it is possible, as long as we keep standing up for ourselves and advocating for ourselves. We can get to that diagnosis, and to show that everybody's journey is different, but at the same time we're in it together. So next week I'll finish up the details on how I got my diagnosis, And, I hope that between now and then, everybody has a good week. Please make sure that you're taking care of yourself, you're using precautions. I will leave my contact information in the description of the podcast. That will have my email, Facebook page, everything like that. If you want to try to contact me about any ideas for episodes, or I'm getting into the process of doing interviews. I know I've said that for a couple of weeks, but I do want to get some of them scheduled. So just reach out to me and I'll be happy to take a look at that. All right, and until then, stay safe. Bye-bye.